pacey and very interesting.
Yep.
I know when you see Mazmatic behind him, you're already starting to think,
Mathematics.
What your Mazmatic wako hapa? So yes, so later on we'll have Churchill Ogutu, who's an economic analyst from Genghis Capital, and also Reginald Kazuzu, a financial analyst, who is also here with us, and Honorable Makali Mulu, Kitui Central Member of Parliament, and Kitui South, I believe, and then member Budget Committee as well. Thank you so much for making time for us. But first, Faisal Ahmed is here to just break down the numbers real quick and tell you what's happening with the budget policy statement. Faisal?
Thank you very much, Trevor. Just to look at some of the numbers here that are making headlines or people have been talking about. The government is planning to raise 2.1 billion shillings in revenue, and out of that 1.8 billion shillings will be ordinary revenue, meaning it will be generated by KRA. We have already seen a shortfall in that of about 110 billion shillings. There's about 316 billion shillings being allocated to counties. And maybe, Trevor, before we jump into this conversation, I just want to ask the member for Kitui Central, Dr. Makali Mulu, have we really missed the target for the second time running? Last year it was about 272 billion shillings. This time round is 110 billion shillings. So what can we do to try and bridge this? Because Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani said that they're actually trying to reduce the targets on KRA because it's been a bit unrealistic for them. So what more can KRA do to try and collect more revenues, or has Treasury just been unrealistic all along?
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting us. I think what is happening is basically, I would say 3 or 4 things are happening. The first one is, I think we have been overambitious in terms of projecting our revenues. The second one, KRA is also facing some administrative challenges in terms of collecting. The third one is Treasury also is applying a lot of pressure to KRA in terms of, you know, when you come up with a budget which is overambitious, then KRA has to be put on pressures to raise the resources. And I think the fourth point is generally the way our economy is performing. I think we are, in terms of our assumptions, when you look at the microeconomic variables, there is need to be a bit realistic. So a combination of those 4 variables results to what we are seeing and our performance in terms of revenue.
And do you think maybe the tax implications that we've had, KRA has also been increasing tax. We've seen an increase in the water bottle industry. There have been an increase, tax increase on that particular segment. Is increased taxation the way to try and meet revenue targets, or is there something different that can be done? And maybe Churchill, you can touch on this as well.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that, yes, there are some measures that are being tried to be put in place by National Treasury to be able to meet that target. But as Mheshimiwa has just alluded to, there's that ambitious target that revenues for the current financial year is at 2.08 trillion. For the next one, there's an increase of 50 billion. So the assumption is that they could be, we are looking at the, what we call the nominal growth. Say they're looking at, it will just be organic, revenues will just grow automatically. And then we have the Finance Act, which will now be put in place now to raise the additional revenues. But that said, and I remember last year when budget appropriation committee was sitting in place, they had their own recommendations, and one of the things they said that we need to get some realistic budgets. If you are not having a scenario whereby we have a balanced budget whereby revenues are matching expenditure, we need to be in a place whereby even the revenues have to be ambitious. If that's not the case, we need to look at some of other ways to raise revenues. And I remember looking at the draft budget policy statement, one of the key issues that had been put in place was that we need to audit the tax exemptions going for the last 5 years, because that's an area whereby you can be able to see revenue slippages. But looking at the final draft, that recommendation is missing, and that tells the whole story that perhaps you are looking at taxing the perhaps even some other places like you had what you had mentioned earlier about the bottles or the turnover tax for the SMEs, but we have these other multinationals whereby perhaps they are getting tax exemptions, but they are not paying the necessary taxes.
It's interesting what you're bringing up, and Reginald, you can jump into this. Mheshimiwa is saying that we are working on an economic performance that may not be realistic. I'm looking at the budget policy statement here, and one of the things they're talking about is that the Kenya's economic growth has remained strong and resilient. The economy is estimated to have expanded by 5.6% in 2019 to the 6.3% in 2018, but partially reflecting the impact of delayed rainfall in the first half 2019 and affected agriculture production. However, they continue to say that the growth momentum is expected to pick up to 6.1% in 2020 and 7.0% over the medium term. That growth, they say, is supported by a rebound in agricultural activities. At a time when we're actually seeing locust invasion and all that, they're still pegging this growth on a 6.1% to 7.7% on agricultural rebound. Are we being realistic here?
I don't think we are being realistic. A plan, which is what this budget policy statement is, or what a budget is only as good as the input that comes into it, the data and the information that you use. And statements like that, where actually my personal opinion is that the budget policy statement is a document full of contradictions and fantasies, because they say the economy is going to grow by 6.1%, and all their parameters for growth are pegged on things that they cannot control. If it rains, yeah, and if the global economy, oil prices do not raise. So how then do you plan an economy on things that you cannot control? So what's the purpose and the role of policy? Do we then need a minister of agriculture, or do we need a bishop to be kneeling and praying for rain? Because clearly we need rain for agriculture to actually to improve. Why I say it's a document full of contradictions, they then say that agriculture is key and it's important. But if you go then to the numbers, you see the allocation for agriculture actually reduced this year to around 48 billion. So your main sector that employs the largest number of employees and generates the largest number of output has the lowest allocation in the budget.
Reginald, I'm glad you say that, because just apart from agriculture, which you've given us as your perfect example, it's the same thing with manufacturing. The Big Four agenda, which is on this budget, it is supposed to create jobs. One way to create jobs in any healthy economy is having a healthy manufacturing industry. In Kenya, we don't have a manufacturing industry. The one thing that ails manufacturing industry, or rather supports manufacturing industry, is electricity. In Kenya, the cost of electricity doesn't allow us to thrive as a manufacturing country. A contradiction, would you not say as well?
Yes, it is a contradiction. And manufacturing is one of the Big Four. But if you look at the current manufacturing that we have in this country, it's agro-processing. Yeah, we are crushing sugarcane to make sugar, maize to make mealie meal, and all those things. If Kenya is going to industrialize, which is a key to actually creating jobs, we have to first look at the base as how then do we transition from an agricultural economy to an industrialized economy? The easiest step to do that is to add value to the agricultural output, because currently you cannot pump money into the manufacturing sector and ignore where they're getting their inputs from, which is the agricultural sector. So if we invest more in the agricultural sector, automate the agricultural sector, increase production per worker, the output per hour in the agricultural sector through innovation and technology, then you'll start seeing we start moving step by step to actually becoming a true middle income country. But just to touch on the matter of tax that guys have talked about, the Jubilee government has been priding itself in creating millions of jobs, but in the informal sector. So you borrow money from wherever you borrow money, invest to create jobs in a sector that you cannot tax. Does not make sense. So you're investing in a place which KRA says we cannot tax the informal sector. We have no mechanisms to tax the informal sector. The formal sector only has a number of employees less than 4 million, 2 million formal workers, and the informal sector is where there is 14 million. So investing a lot in an informal sector, which you are not formalizing, therefore KRA will never meet the revenue target, because where you are claiming there is growth, you are not able to harvest or tax that side of the sector.
Right. We'll definitely hear from Honorable Mulu on that. But right now, Faisal has more numbers for us. Faisal?
Thank you very much, Zinzi. If you can see the screen behind me, we are looking at the consolidated fund services, which has been allocated around 763.2 billion shillings. Debt repayment at 174 billion shillings. I'll come back to that figure in a moment. And the budget deficit of around 614 billion shillings. And I just want to touch on this number a little bit, and I'll bring in some of the analysts here with us. Domestically, the government is expected to borrow around 222 billion shillings and 345 billion shillings from the foreign markets. Now, these already have their own implications. And if I'm not mistaken, maybe Churchill, you can just clarify this number. We're about to pay over 400 billion shillings in interest, not the principal amount that we've borrowed, but interest. What sort of implication does this have on our economy when we're paying interest that is that high on such expensive loans that are used in development projects? One question that I also want to pose to Mheshimiwa is that what policies can the legislature bring up in terms of government borrowing locally, which is actually very, very expensive? So maybe if you could just take us through those numbers, first of them being the issue of the deficit. Churchill.
That's a very interesting conversation, Churchill, because if our deficit now is 614 billion and we are paying 400 billion as interest.
Yes, it's quite staggering, and it's no surprise if you look at the fact that the stock of the debt is around 6 trillion. So, and the kind of interest you're paying is on all the debt that we have, both on the domestic and also on the external. But looking at 5 years, 6 years back, when we had all this bias towards commercial financing, whereby we had the syndicated loans, we had the Eurobonds, so you find that automatically we are getting to this point whereby interest payment currently is at 442 billion, and as a percentage of revenues, ordinary revenues, that's around 20%. 2 trillion. So it's 20% of the revenues going towards interest payment. And remember that interest payment is part of the consolidated fund services, whereby that's the first charge. Say, for instance, that in a fiscal year we're able to get 600 billion in revenues, all of it going toward repayment of the debt. And it's just it's telling us that now the balance is now what goes towards recurrent and development expenditure. So that's a big concern. And just to also elaborate further is that there's another component of repayment, which is now the debt repayment, the principal component of it. But what the budget policy statement has on its numbers is now the debt repayment for the external loans, which is around 131 billion for the current financial year, which is ending in June, and for the next financial year is around 174 billion. But we don't have yet the figures for the domestic repayment. Now that's the T-bills and the T-bonds. Right. They're still moving figures, so it's understandably that we don't have them currently at the moment, but we're expecting another, say, close to another 130 billion in terms of domestic debt repayment. So all these figures, we are looking at consolidated fund services. The current financial year is around 805 billion, which that is the amount of money which even Mheshimiwas don't even debate about it in Parliament, consolidated fund services. What is usually debated is now things to do with the national government, the allocations to the national government. They could be reduced, they could be added, they could be increased, but consolidated fund services is given as it is, so no one debates about it here. But that's where the elephant in the room lies into. So it's something that going forward, we're expecting it could even hit 900 billion in the next financial year from 805 billion. So it's quite a concern going forward.
Honorable Mulu, where do we draw the balance between borrowing for development and not borrowing at all? Because here we are paying interest of 400 billion and our deficit is 614 billion. More than half of that is being borrowed in the domestic market, which is then essentially locks out everybody else who wants credit.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. I think let me just pick it from where he has left it. And I think what we are saying is the issue of payment of interest and the principal amount is an issue of concern to this country. And it should be an issue of concern to all of us. What is happening? If you look at the BPS, there's a projected growth of revenue by about 160 billion. And despite that growth, you realize the total projected expenditure is reducing. So what is going to happen? Actually, that additional revenue is supposed to go to payment of from the consolidated fund services. That is the issue of pensions and the issue of debt. So you can see now it means whatever additional amount you're going to collect, then it has to go to paying. And really, as I say, I've always said when I come to this studio, the issue is that borrowing is not bad.
Yes.
And even at personal level, for you to develop, you need to borrow.
Yes.
But what makes the difference is you're borrowing for what? So if you purely borrow and you saw that money in development, and you do proper appraisal of the development projects so that in terms of returns, they can, after some time, they can be able to repay all that loan from the on-generated resources, then that borrowing can be sustainable. But when you borrow and then you're borrowing and you put in projects, some of which don't even get to conclusion,
yes,
and we have a number of examples in this country.
I want to hear from Reginald.
Where we have already buried. I wish you allow me one or two minutes just to put a few things into context. Where you borrow money and you put in projects which then get stored, money is stolen, and then in that case, then you rather not borrow.
Okay.
But I want to put just three things into context based on what we discussed earlier. The issue of the agricultural budget. Just to add to what he said, let's not forget that agriculture is also devolved. So out of the 316.5 billion, which is going to the counties, a big chunk of that is also supposed to support agriculture. The other thing is the issue of manufacturing, where we are saying, as one of the big four, we are projected to move to 15% contribution.
Yes.
From about now 10. We need to realize, BPS being, or a budget being a statement of intent. If you look at this BPS, I must really congratulate the new CS Treasury. One thing they have done, which is very good, although I doubt whether they will implement, there is a proposal to come up with the new economic zones. There is a proposal to come up with the new industrial parks. And if these are implemented, like in Naivasha, we propose to have a new industrial park. So these are the growth points, where if they are implemented, they can achieve that level. And then the issue of the tax, in addition to what he said, I think it's also important in this country to broaden the tax bracket. We have so many Kenyans who should be paying taxes, and they're not paying. If we brought everybody into that bracket, we can easily even reduce the rate of taxation.
Okay. Reginald, before I throw it back to Faisal, just to give us a few more numbers, let's pick it up from what Honorable Mulu talked about. Borrowing is not a problem. It's what are you borrowing for? That is a big question. Here's the thing. Kenya's debt, is it sustainable where we are?
Kenya's debt...
And do you see it staying sustainable?
Kenya's debt stopped being sustainable a long time ago. It stopped being sustainable in 2013 when they rebased GDP. The main reason for rebasing GDP is that there was no more borrowing room. So what do? You rebase GDP, your GDP grows, and you say our debt to GDP is below 50%.
As a financial expert, so you feel our debt is...
Kenyan debt is not sustainable for primarily two reasons. One of them, Dr. Makali has already said it. When your debt becomes unproductive, you are borrowing to put into projects which are not generating enough to repay that debt. What does that mean? That means there will just generally be an increase in taxation in the future. And that is something that Kenyans need to brace for. There's no way this government is going to get out of this either without borrowing or increasing taxation. We are now borrowing to pay back debt. Last year we went to the Eurobond market, not to borrow for development. We borrowed to retire the previous Eurobond that we had.
The first one we took. Yes.
Number three, we have currency mismatch. We are borrowing in dollars to invest in projects that generate Kenya shillings. Our exports have been coming down. We only generate dollars through exports, through tourism. And recently now, this new fictitious figure that we are given by a central bank called diaspora remittances. All of a sudden, all Kenyans in the diaspora got salary increments and they're sending more money back home. Again, especially when the government starts giving you figures which you cannot verify, is the moment that you start having to question what they are trying to propagate. So when jobs are created in the informal sector and your main source of dollars becomes diaspora remittances, you have two figures which become very difficult to audit. So our debt, the way it is currently, it is one, it's not productive, it is not sustainable. Currently, with the current projection of 11 trillion GDP for 2020, we're at 63%. I doubt the 11 trillion itself. But debt will be around 6 point something trillion. The government has a pension liability before they move to this new system of 1 trillion. So if you actually add that to the current debt, you have a debt of 7 trillion over a GDP of 11 trillion. It does not make sense for the size of the economy that we have. But just to mention on something that Mheshimiwa mentioned on special economic zones. sometimes I feel like our budget policy statement is a good composition. Yeah. So yes, they've mentioned we want to put special economic zones. What are these special economic zones going to do? So there's no point of buying land and saying, now this area is special economic zone. What exactly are we trying to achieve there is what is not coming out, and that's how money is stolen. But someone will say, it was in the budget, we were supposed to buy this land for a special economic zone, but what is going to be produced there?
Yes, value of the return.
And I think I've mentioned it before, saying we need to take a seat back and say, we have a lot of data coming from the port of Mombasa. What are our neighbors importing from outside, and can we make it here? Then that will advise, now let's make a special economic zone. If you look at the 295 billion that they want to spend under energy infrastructure, information, communication and technology, where they are spending the money, construction of 65,000 housing units, construction of bus rapid transport infrastructure, 48 BRT station parks, 4 depots, 60 kilometers BRT lanes, 13 flagship markets, 2,900 kilometers of transmission lines, 6,000 kilometers of roads, construction of Naivasha Special Economic Zone, given just like a line item. So most of this 295 is going to go to bus parks, creating lanes for this bus rapid transport thing that they are trying to do, and 2,000 kilometers of transmission lines. So when we say they are putting money in the big four, 295 billion is going into this. And the things that have been mentioned here, I'm wondering which of these is actually an enabler to the big four.
Will the Jubilee government have bitten too much than it can chew? All those sounds very good, but the delivery of it, and we only have 2 years for the Jubilee administration to be out of government. From where you sit as a financial analyst, has Jubilee government bitten more than it can chew?
Yes, they are trying to do too many things at the same time without the money to do it.
All right, Faisal?
Thank you very much, Zinzi. Reginald, I'll just pick up from where you left off. Some of the things that you've mentioned are actually very interesting. The government moved from the 50% of GDP regime to an absolute figure of 9 trillion shillings. Now this could actually change. Now what sort of implication, because most of the currency that we borrow on are international currencies, if the shilling actually fluctuates, what sort of implication will this have on our debt, and by how much, depending on how the currency changes, by how much are we expected maybe to increase the debt service towards this particular loans that we've borrowed? Maybe Churchill, you could pick on that.
One of the things in the budget policy statement is risk sensitivities. But in terms of one of the things that is coming out from that is depreciation in the exchange rate, now to the tune of 10%. But now it's more skewed towards the revenues and the expenditure, and looking at the budget balance. So in total, that in aggregate, we are looking at an increase in 3.4%. If there's a depreciation of 10% in the currency, that's the Kenya shillings vis-a-vis the dollar. But having said that, and just to look at now this issue about the debt, you find that for the next financial year is skewed towards external debt to the tune of 345 billion, vis-a-vis now the domestic at 223 billion shillings. But that said, there's a focus towards eliminating the commercial financing, because that's where the elephant in the room is. Commercial financing here is now the syndicated loans, the Eurobonds, whereby in particular the syndicated loans are quite expensive. You find that it's around 8% on the dollar, which is really expensive. And if there's a fluctuation, the dollar to the Kenya shilling, it tends now to aggravate even the debt repayments going forward. So there's bias towards moving away from those kind of loans to the concessional loans, which is now project loans. The interest rate on that is around 1%. There's a grace period of 10 years, and then maturity of it is 25 years. So there are two things that coming from that bias towards commercial, towards concessional financing. One is that the interest rate component will come lower from around 8% or 10% to 1%, and there's that extension of when the debt is being repaid finally. You find that with syndicated loans, they're less than 10 years, but if you're looking at concessional loans, which are 25 years, so it's lengthening the maturity of those loans, with the expectations by that time the loans will be due, our growth will have risen, so it will be much easier for us to repay back those debts. But I think the realism towards it in the short term it's quite ambitious, because for one, if you look at the concessional loans, you find that you have to go negotiate, say, with Chinese lenders to be able to give us those loans. And remember that those loans are more or less project-oriented loans. So it's for us as Kenya to show the lenders, say, for example, China, if they're giving us a concession loan, there's a project tied to that, such that they can be able to give us a concessional loan, and there's a grant element towards it, which makes it concessional to the tune of 35%. But I think in the short term, that's quite a bit ambitious in my view. So we'll still see that we'll still revert back in the short term to mostly the Eurobonds, at least to plug that deficit in the external financing.
All right. Honorable Mulu, as a member of the Budget Committee, wind this conversation up for us. So what will be your input henceforth? What is your advice going forward?
I think what we're going to do, and we started discussing this BPS yesterday with the departments, that is the ministries, departments and agencies. And what we are trying to do is we are trying to look at this document and say, this being a policy document, we want to see to what extent is it aligned to the existing policies in the country, and to what extent is the budget then supporting those policies. I want to say this. When you look at the document, it says, for example, if we don't achieve the projected growth of 6.1 by about 1%, if we did only 5.1% growth this year, then in terms of revenue collection, we'll have lost about 18 billion. So it means what we call the fiscal risks, we really need to analyze them very well and come up with what I call mitigating strategies in terms of how do we address them. For example, the issue you raise about foreign exchange. While we are saying if our shilling depreciates, it is going to be good for our exports because we export more and we get more in terms of value.
Yes.
But the other side, in a situation where most of our public debt is denominated in foreign exchange, then it means we'll be paying more. So it's like a double-sorted kind of sort. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of saying, when you pay more in terms of public debt, does that cancel what you are getting in terms of additional revenue as a result of the exports? And depending on the ratios, then you might find you are badly off. The other thing we are saying is, when you look at the other risks, for example, the day before yesterday there was an attack, Al-Shabaab attack, somewhere in Mandera. When that signal is sent out, that a part of this country has been attacked by Shabaab, how does that affect tourism, which is one of our also earning kind of sector, brings some earnings? How does that affect the general performance in that area, economic performance in the area? So we are saying, when you look at this BPS, in terms of the exposure, the risks we have been exposed to, there might be need really to seriously look at it, and I think as Parliament, that's what we are now trying to, those are the hard questions we're asking the departments. That when you say this is going to happen, there are issues of terrorism, there are issues of cybercrime, because these issues all relate to generating revenue. And I think generally, as Kenyans, what we are saying is, one thing I must congratulate the minister. And I think this is what I said the other time I was here. I said, we need to live within our means.
Okay.
The fact that we see a trend where a minister is saying, when you look at the supplementary budget, the one we approved a figure of about 2.9 trillion. Now, they have moved from there to about 2.7, actually a reduction of about 150 billion. I'm telling you, it is not easy as a CS finance to have a budget which is taking you downwards instead of upwards. Because generally, countries want to see budgets increasing so that they look, we are doing well. So the fact that we are accepting as Kenyans that now we better start being realistic in terms of our figures, I think is a good move. And as Parliament, we are going to support whatever move will be put forward to Parliament so that we start living within our means. And I think really the issue of Kenya, we have as Kenyans, and the issue which I would really encourage all of us, even the experts, is that we need to think about prudent use of resources. Actually, this country has a lot of resources. If we just focus more on how application and proper analysis in terms of projects. Because what we are failing mostly is the issue of appraising the projects, what we call project appraisal. And I'm happy that now, as a result of our recommendation last year, Now Treasury has a whole department, which is going to be really focusing on project appraisal.
We really have to end it there. But do you believe Ukur Yatani is the man for the job? Yes or no?
I think he started well.
Great.
He's on the right track.
Churchill?
On the right track.
Reginald? Ukur Yatani, the CS?
No.
No. You don't think it's the broom that will fix it?
No. The problem is bigger than him.
Okay.
So to lay it on one person, it's we're just setting ourselves up. There's a whole structural discussion the government needs to sit and actually do.
Okay.
Not just one individual.
All right. Churchill Ogutu, economic analyst with Genghis Capital, and Reginald Kazuzu, financial analyst. But Reginald is staying with us for a bit. Honorable Makali Mulu, Kitui Central Member of Parliament, and also a member of the Budget Committee. And they are done with that conversation on the budget policy statement. But Faisal, you still have some numbers before we get into the different conversation we're having about digital lending?
Yeah, Trevor, I do have some numbers here for you. Now, maybe we could just look at the external deficit. This is something that I had, the budget deficit, this is something that I had mentioned earlier. The external financing for the deficit is around 345.2 billion shillings, 222 billion shillings being generated from commercial banks. The public debt stands at 6.1 trillion shillings. Remember, the government moved from the 50% of GDP regime to an absolute figure of 9 trillion shillings, meaning that our external debt is at 3.1 trillion shillings and domestic debt is at 3 trillion shillings. Both those figures are more than what we are planning for in this fiscal year budget at 2.9 billion shillings. This is a very broad topic that cannot be exhausted in one sitting. Maybe, Trevor, we can do this probably next week and maybe take this conversation further.
Yep, Faisal is the man with the mathematic. But we have to take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll talk about taming the digital lenders in just a bit.
Yep.